I will quickly introduce the panel. And so, as you know, it's the links between migration and slavery from Latin America to the Middle East, to the African continent, to Southeast Asia. Everywhere this happens. And if saving lives is indeed something that is today forbidden and that can put you in jail, yeah, it is just amazing. So the moderator for this panel is, of course, one of our permanent friends, Nazir Afzal. You know him. He has been either speaking or moderating at each of our conferences. He was the chief executive of the Police and Crime Commissioners for England and Wales. Before that, he was a prosecutor, and he has prosecuted more honor crimes in the northern of England than anybody else. And he is an extraordinary man. Nazir will moderate. Duncan Breen. Duncan Breen is at the UNHCR, which is the most efficient part of the UN. So we are lucky to have the UNHCR with us today because they are the ones to deal with the refugees. And they have many limitations, and he will speak of that. We have Asiba Adjasarawi. She is the Humanitarian Affairs Advisor of Médecins Sans Frontières. She has not only been in Libya all the time and everywhere around Mediterranean, but she has also been in Bangladesh with the Rohingyas, etc. So she has a lot to tell us. We have Innocent Mangabi, and he is an extraordinary man who has just spent most of his life as a refugee in a camp. What is it to be a refugee in a camp? He has just written a book about it, and I think you can all find it on Amazon. I will show it to you after. And finally, we have Asif Saleh, who is the number 2 of BRAC. You heard him yesterday because BRAC has created one of the biggest banks in Asia, so you are speaking of the banks. But today, he will speak of what BRAC is doing in Bangladesh for the Rohingya refugees. So please come on stage and join Francesco.
The United Nations says that 68.5 million people are currently displaced from their homes by war, persecution or violence. On average, one person was uprooted every 2 seconds last year. As much of the world looks to push back on the wave of migration, those on the move are becoming increasingly vulnerable to human traffickers. The rise of anti-immigration political parties in nations from Italy to Slovenia, added to Europe-wide efforts to stem migration, means more migrants in Libya are struggling to leave. They are trapped in detention or fall into the hands of traffickers. Libya's Coast Guard and the Italian government have imposed a crackdown, meaning those rescued at sea are now taken back to Tripoli, where they are held, often undocumented. Libya is now in charge of containing the flow of migrants to the EU. It's meant that the likes of the UNHCR and Médecins Sans Frontières aren't able to monitor accurately and protect those stuck in Libya. Many end up sold as slaves or rented out in Libyan markets, as smugglers look for other ways to capitalize on their human cargo. For the Rohingyas, it's the same story. Those in desperate need are easy prey for those who trade in human lives. Refugee camps trying to cope with the 700,000 Rohingyas who have fled persecution in Myanmar provide fertile ground. As countries around the world increasingly close their borders to migrants, how can we stop them being so easily picked up by traffickers?
Good morning to you all. I'm actually quite angry, and I think we all are. Before I share my anger with you, can I thank Monique and trust the Thomson Reuters Foundation and colleagues for all of you coming. It's always the highlight of my year. and I'm sure it is the heart of yours. And I think perhaps the most important thing is that we all go away with actions and what it is that we will do differently and what others will do differently. But I think just listen to Francesco a moment ago. I don't know about you, but I share his anger. You know, until the midterm elections last week, we kept hearing about this caravan of refugees traveling through Central America, full of smallpox, Muslim jihadis. Since the election, no mention of it. And you have to ask yourself that people are playing politics with human beings and will continue to do so unless we have some action. So we have limited time, and what I want to do, if it's okay with you, well, you've got no choice, actually, is I'm going to invite our panel to spend a couple of minutes just setting out really what their thoughts are before we have a conversation. Hasiba, do you want to start first?
Yeah, I'm going to start with, so I work for Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and we are firsthand witnessing the cost of the inhuman policies that European countries and others are implementing. So I just want to share some stories with you. Many Eritrean women who are fleeing Eritrea because of persecution there will undertake the journey through Europe, going through Ethiopia, Sudan, Libya, and the Central Mediterranean. Most of them, before undertaking the journey, will have an injection of contraceptive because they know that they're most likely to be raped during that journey, and they're trying to limit the negative consequences on their health of that. Why do they have to take so much risk? Because there are no safe and legal routes for people to seek protection. So this is not an unfortunate situation. This is the result of policies that are adopted in your name and in our names, all of us. The lack of safe and legal routes, as well as the criminalization of individuals, people now are labeled as being illegal migrants rather than people who need protection. Illegal migrant means you can be arrested at any time. It means that you don't have access to services, including in these countries where you can't go to a hospital to get medical care if you are not able to prove that you are legally here. And all this creates an environment that is fertile ground for trafficking. There is a direct link between the criminalization of people and the risk of trafficking. And Francesco, you've said it has become a political act to save people. Actually, the experience of MSF through our boat that we operate with SOS Méditerranée at sea doing search and rescue is that it's not even a political act. It has become a criminal act. And I'd be very happy to talk you through all the criminal investigations we have faced, the fact that we've lost our flag twice in the span of 2 months, and that we docked in Marseille, not able to do search and rescue while people are trying to flee Libya.
Thank you, Hasiba. Duncan.
Thanks, Nazir. In 2018, over 1,100 people are believed to have died while trying to cross the sea from Libya to Europe. With the low number of arrivals to Europe from Libya this year, this amounts to 1 death for every 13 people arriving in Europe from Libya in the first 10 months of 2018. But the sea journey is only one of the many risks that people face along the way. By the time that people step on board one of the flimsy dinghies or wooden boats at the Libyan coast, many will have been tortured, raped, held for ransom, and seen people die around them. Some will have fallen victim to trafficking, sometimes after being recruited from home, such as in the case of Nigerian women and girls, for sexual exploitation in Libya or in Europe. Others will have fallen victim to trafficking along the way, including after being sold by smugglers into situations of forced labor or sexual exploitation. Similarly, some will have been held for ransom, sometimes multiple times, and been subjected to torture and other abuses to encourage payment. Some of those subjected to these abuses are people who are seeking international protection, and others may have international protection needs arising from their experience of trafficking along the way. Collectively, we need to be doing more to strengthen protection against trafficking and for those who have fallen victim to traffickers. This means strengthening protection in countries along the route, as well as for victims who reach Europe, including access to safe shelter and to legal aid. We also need to do more to ensure that traffickers and others committing these types of abuses against refugees and migrants are held accountable, something that our High Commissioner called for at the Security Council last year. Depending on the time available today, I'm hoping to share with you some stories of people affected by trafficking and related abuses along the Central Mediterranean route, and tell you a little bit more about what we're doing in response, as well as talk a bit more about some of the actions that are still needed.
Thank you, Jonkin. Innocent, you uniquely have been a refugee, so would you share some of your thoughts on the subject?
Yes. When growing up, I didn't know that I was different. Although the community I was living with, they looked like me. They were all black, just like me. Only to be told that I was different, and because my parents ran away from Burundi and came to the Congo. So as a kid, I was like, why did you run away? And I could see like the mountains on the other side of the Lake Tanganyika. And growing up was really difficult because discrimination was everywhere. So I had to learn the Congolese languages just to be able to navigate life, to minimize discrimination. After 17 years of being in the refugee camp in Congo, the war started in Congo, and I had to run away without my family, without my siblings. I was the last born. It was a difficult journey. From Congo to Tanzania, later on to Zambia. And just, I couldn't understand why do we have wars in Africa. And you hear stories that Western countries are the ones supporting the wars for the comfort of their people. And you wonder, what needs to be done? These are the people who are leading the world, and yet they are closing their eyes to the suffering of the people for their comfort. And here they are saying that we are doing great to save the poor Africans. Something needs to change. Sometimes we know the right button to press, but we go to the wrong button just because this one is feeding us. Something is wrong.
True. Asif, would you like to share some of your thoughts on the subject? Sure. Initial thoughts.
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank Andrew. I actually didn't know that the maps came from Planet because we got it from UNHCR. Right. And 6 months ago, we were all just talking about landslide in the Kutupalong camp. And thanks to that intervention, we removed at least 10,000 households, most vulnerable people. Landslides happened, but only 2 people died. So it's a great example of how technology actually helped. So I want to just focus a bit on the Rohingya situation. As all of you know, that about a little more than a year ago, close to 1 million people just showed up at Bangladesh's doorstep. And they were traumatized, they were tortured, and they faced the worst possible kind of genocide that you all know. So what a lot of you don't know is that 80% of this population were women and children. And women in the Rohingya women in the Rakhine community, they were basically the invisible gender of a stateless minority. And even before coming to Bangladesh, they were barely had any literacy. They had no say in decision making. They basically had any kind of human development you can think about. They were completely absent from their lives. So they became the most vulnerable when this crisis happened. However, what happened was that when they faced the crisis, they came to the forefront of saving their family, saving their household. They were at the center of it. And amazingly, over the last 1 year, there were the interventions that have gone in. Initially, it was a very crisis-led humanitarian support. But a lot of our support actually went into focusing on these women by women themselves. So in terms of humanitarian effort, a lot of the child-friendly spaces we had, the teachers we had, all were led by women as well. We had Rohingya women volunteering to go to household. 800 of them were visiting all the households. So they actually built a bridge of reliability and trust among the Rohingya community and the host community. So 1 year later, even though there are still a lot of issues in terms of gender-based violence, we are starting to see a change in their attitude. They are talking. They're talking with their eyes, making eye contact. They're coming out. They're asking for more opportunities. But the problems remain, right? And as basically there's a sense of certain kind of normalcy coming into these camps. What's happening is that the gender-based violence within the camps is increasing. And we had about 10,000 reported cases of gender-based violence since they arrived. And it's getting worse as basically frustration keeping in because they are not sure about future, what's going to happen to them, whether it's outside, they're going back or staying here. Because one thing that our colleague from MSF mentioned that, Bangladesh, although hosted them, but they didn't give them the legal rights as refugees. They're still called as forcibly displaced population from Myanmar. As a result, they have no legal recourse. There's no legal rights if any kind of violation happens to their rights. So I'm going to stop at that.
I said, thank you so much. We're trying to explore here the links between migration and modern slavery. And I suppose the assumption there is that there are slavers that are encouraging this migration. Is that a view that anybody shares? I can't imagine that is. But clearly, when you have organizations incentivize, I would imagine they regularly say, we need to reduce our costs, we need to reduce our bottom line. The best way to do that is to have the cheapest labor known to man. And therefore, how do we incentivize organizations not to do that? Does anybody have an answer?
In the context of Africa, you have refugees who run away from their countries. They go into a refugee camp and they don't have any rights. And when you are living in a country, you have the potential to make a living, but you are told, no, don't do anything because you are supposed to be in a refugee camp. And yet, the food that UNHCR gives you is not enough to sustain your family. Now, people just decide to go illegally to seek for employment. And because the ones who are giving you an employment know that you don't have the rights, they'll treat you anyhow they want. Mm-hmm. So, in the context of Africa, I would say African countries should understand that, to give the rights to refugees of employment is a must, not something that they need to think about. Because without doing that, they are putting the poor refugees at risk of being exploited.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking, there's a common phrase that whenever you have a natural disaster, the first plane is the one full of traffickers. Is that just an anecdote, or is that a view that some of us would share? Obviously, Francesca, I hope that your plane is the first plane that arrives, but are they that sophisticated that they can get in there as fast as possible in order to take individuals and traffic individuals?
You mean
the traffickers, yeah.
I think that the traffickers reminds me an old movie which I don't remember if it was Cary Grant that said in the dead worker it's better to fish. That it's the crises are feeding the trafficker. This is not. I don't think that I think it's the opposite of what you said. So they are only using opportunities. The fact that we are not fixing the crisis, that there are facts that Western countries are sometimes even feeding or finances the crisis, as Ison had just mentioned, is the big responsibility of the West. What made me so angry is the fact that I started to volunteer, just as an example. In 1988, receiving in Italy those who were fleeing Horn of Africa, Mengistu regime.
Yeah.
After exactly 30 years in Europe, half of the migrants that are arriving on our coast are coming from half of Africa. And I always think about how many billions of dollars, of euros, have been invested in the Horn of Africa with this big failure. So traffickers are only using these opportunities, these big opportunities, to. This is the responsibility. It's up to the governments, then not to the traffickers. We have always had criminal organized crime. Yes. It's about the governments to fight the organized crime. So this is a matter of fact for me. This is not something that we can. It's not up to the humanitarian organization to fight the organized crime. No. We can only give advices to the governments. We only try to ask them to set up better policies.
Are governments colluding with traffickers? Are they? Because governments benefit from the fact that they will have large industries staffed by cheap labour, etc., etc. Are governments in some way colluding with them?
Only simply that they don't care. In the moment that they are externalizing the border, in the moment that they don't care if from the Mediterranean now they are sending back people in a country where these people are exploited or where there are action for human beings and they simply don't care, but we all know that this is happening. Mm-hmm. So this is where lies the responsibility of the governments.
Okay.
I think I'd go a bit further here. What we've seen, and we are in a room full of activists combating trafficking. We have seen governments co-opting the discourse of fighting trafficking in order to sell their migration control policies. They have very little concerns for the victims of trafficking. So it's all about law enforcement, it's all about migration control, it is not about the survivors. And that's horrendous to see, because I have to say, at MSF, we have been accused by some very senior official European leader that we are colluding with traffickers. When we see that, for example, we would help in Libya a group of victims of trafficking who has just escaped from one of the trafficking hubs. We treat them, we take them to hospital, and the next day they're transferred to detention centers. Several months later, they're still there. These people need help. They don't need detention. So the whole trafficking discourse is really to hide behind and to try to legitimize the negative consequences of migration control.
Nazir, if I can just jump in here as well. I mean, if we look at some of the changing patterns in relation to movement along the central Mediterranean route, so people who were traveling through Libya, one of the key dynamics is that you do have these linkages between smuggling and trafficking in different places. Yeah. So if you want to cross the desert, if you want to go into Libya, you do have to rely on smugglers. The desert crossing is a particularly hard place. It's a place that we could talk about the kinds of abuses that take place there. But you are intensely vulnerable in that situation, and you don't have control about what happens to you on arrival. So the stories that we get are that once people arrive in Libya, some people who may have paid up front they may have paid their smuggling fees up front, they then are able to continue their journey. Others who have actually paid, they're told, no, you didn't pay. And so there's a range of things that actually happen to them there. Sometimes then people are held and then tortured, and they're told that they must call family members who must send money. If that's not successful, and it quite quickly becomes clear who's able to pay and who's not, then there are some people who have told us, well, I was traveling with my wife. People were threatening then to sell my wife into prostitution. Or otherwise then, okay, we're going to find money from you in another way. So we're going to keep you here. You'll work for us for the next 6 months. And then ultimately it's ended up being just working in these conditions for a year, unpaid, before eventually being told, okay, you can go now, and being taken to the coast. Mm-hmm. So what we see at the moment then in these conditions where fewer people are being able to leave the coast is that more people seem to be trapped into this kind of cycle where some of the groups that are involved in trying to make money from this movement of people, some of the people in need of international protection, some people traveling for different reasons. And so that includes then this way of holding people for ransom, some armed groups then also trying to kidnap the groups that are being guided by other smugglers as a means to try and extort them. And that's the kind of cycle that we're seeing at the moment, which is very worrying.
I'm going to just as I think Francesca said a moment ago, organised crime has always been there. They will find some other commodity. If we were able to deal with this issue, they'll find some other commodity. I'm interested in what people have been saying about how it's now political to save a life, how it's now criminal to save a life. And you know, we're building borders, or we're building walls around Europe and around the world, aren't we? Where we're saying that an individual is not allowed to come in. And if they do come in, they come in under the wall, and then they are treated in the way that you just described, Duncan. How do we start? Let's try and get some positivity here. How do we start to address this movement towards politicization and criminalization of those of us who want to help? Asif?
I think it starts with us, all of us. I mean, basically, over the last few years, and it's growing in every country, this polarization, this anti-immigrant attitude, I mean, this whole nationalistic fervor, that has been so rampant. So that's the battle we need to fight, because governments in a lot of these countries are getting extremely nationalistic, dictatorial. I mean, this conversation is democracy dying, right? I mean, and they're all playing to the fear of people that, you know, we are losing out. So that's basically, as I think this morning presentation was great, that we really need to find like-minded individuals, the critical mass among all the sectors, whether it's private, public, social, and really start to talk to each other and strategize about how do we change mindsets. And we got to start early, and whether it's in schools, whether it's in university, young people have to be very much involved in this process. That diversity is important, that this is very basic, but you know, it's almost like we are going back in ages like
I'm just thinking, I mean, we got here, the MSF, UNHCR, we've got the Red Cross, organizations that I grew up thinking were people who were saving lives. And, you know, because we couldn't do it, they were doing it. And now you are being attacked, day in, day out, for doing something that we used to, and I hope still do in majority anyway, welcome and support.
I mean, I've worked on the Middle East and North Africa for decades, and then I'm now supporting our operations in the central Mediterranean Sea. And what I see is something that I'd never thought would happen. I see European governments relying on tactics that are textbook from the most dictatorial governments, trying to limit NGOs and trying to strangle them, all sorts of ways. So to give you the example of MSF, we have had to face a number of criminal investigations in Italy for aiding illegal migration, for example, when at the same time, every operation was being carried out under the coordination of the Italian authorities. There was this idea suddenly that NGOs needed a code of conduct because we were not respecting the law. Again, we were acting in full transparency under the coordination of the Italian authorities. And I can go on and on. Yeah. And the last that we've seen happening is, because they couldn't fault us, they're now resorted to putting pressure on other governments to redraw the flag of the ship that we operate in the Mediterranean Sea. So we had the flag from Gibraltar, there was some pressure, we lost the flag of Gibraltar, we got a flag from Panama, and then Panama came under threat that Panamanian fleet will be denied access to European ports if they don't redraw the flag. Things that I did not think I would see in Europe in the 21st century. People are dying at the doors of Europe, and the response is to criminalize the NGOs, but also to criminalize the very human act of solidarity. What we have seen across Europe is a series of trials where individuals like you and I are being prosecuted for helping another person, for offering a lift, for offering a bed, for offering food. Is this what we want to become?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the Hungarian government recently, yes. There's a law now that says NGOs can't help. I mean, a law that says you can't help. And so it's also really dangerous for those of you who work in this field. So if you're a member of the MSF or working for the UN, the UN sign used to be, oh, this is somebody you should protect and it will protect. But, and similarly with the Red Cross and Red Crescent. But now you are seen as a target. And that, because governments and the rhetoric is being upped to the point where it is being upped, you are now seeing that your people are under attack.
Yeah, I think we need to redefine the conflict, first of all, because I feel like many conflicts are labeled that they are tribal and civil conflicts, and yet they are not. They are wars that are engineered to foster international trade that the Western countries are benefiting. So if we redefine those wars and conflicts, we'll be able to say, like the people will be able to say to the government, to say, okay, you are involved in this conflict in the Congo or wherever for, in Libya, for the profit that you are targeting. Now, why don't you allow Libyan refugees to come? So if you, I don't know if what I'm saying is making sense. Like if we redefine the wars, if you define the conflict, it will be easy for the community, for the people to take to task their leaders and be able to, to look at the issue of migrants with compassion rather than rejection. Mm-hmm. The issue of supporting refugees and migrants, not as a crime. That has never and should never be.
Can I add one thing very quickly? I mean, I think governments also are responding to, or sometimes motivating the public as well, right? Whether it's Trumpism or Putinism, whatever you call it, where media is the enemy of the people, to NGOs can't help, law. These are all along the same thread where this perception is being created that all of these activities that civil society does or the social sector are bad things. So these are all recipes for authoritarianism, and in a sense. So, and in a lot of cases, public is also supporting it. So I think we also need to address that issue, that why in a lot of these cases, majority are supporting them. That's why I'm going back to that unless we start early changing hearts and minds and going back to the basics,
No, absolutely. I think anybody would disagree that we need to educate our young, because ultimately that will bring about the generational change that you talk about. I think we're talking about now, but I think what you said a moment ago, Innocent, about the information being king or queen here. Information is power, but we're in an era of fake news. We're in an era where we saw the phenomenal diagrams from space showed us the refugees here, refugees there. Rest assured, there'll be somebody creating some fake ones to show something else. I mean, just this week in the UK, we had 3 inflatable dinghies, for the first time ever, seemingly, arrive on the south coast of England, containing refugees. And UK, they must have come a long way, but now they came from France. I think one has to, but people were talking about fake news will take over. And it will become something, sadly, where those people who want to, who have an agenda, will undoubtedly say what they want to say. You going to say something?
I think it's a very valid point. And what we see is that clearly vilifying refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers, and vilifying those supporting them, is likely to secure your election in Europe these days. That's a quick win. Those are people who don't vote. You can vilify them, and then you get elected. And what we need, and that's why I'm mentioning this to you, is also we need fact-based policies that are not based on fears, but on evidence. And this is why also research by academics and by all sorts of institutions are important. We need also companies to speak out, because we do rely on migrant workers. I'm a migrant, for example, and I'm sure that half of this room is. And also we need to humanize people. We have become completely numb to the pain of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nazir, if I may, just on this issue also of the politicization of around trafficking, including through the Central Med, similarly to the discussions around movement through Central America towards the US. I mean, now that the situation has changed somewhat and very few people are arriving in Europe from Libya, I think what will be critical is that some of the commitments that were being made in terms of addressing trafficking, it's important to keep pushing ahead on some of those that actually then there is strengthened protection for the people who may be victims of trafficking, both before they even reach Libya, but then also once they arrive in Europe. But the same in terms of some of the efforts that have been set up in terms of accountability as well. There have been a number of institutions that have been talking about strengthening the steps for accountability. There have been moves at the Security Council, including listing a number of people for sanctions purposes. But it's important that this issue doesn't then fall off the agenda now that seemingly the migration through the Central Med is perhaps less of a political issue with reduced numbers arriving this way.
But what's the incentive? I mean, I saw a program about Spain last week, which showed 100 square miles of these tented cities where they make our fruit and vegetable. You know, the UK doesn't have any opportunity to grow fruit and vegetables in the winter, so we buy them from southern Spain, and in fact, enormous amounts of it. And of course, who's delivering the labour? It's the migrants, it's the forced labour, and it's as visible. As you know, it's so visible, but nobody seems to want to do anything about it because where's the incentive for governments, authorities to do something about it when they all seem to be making something out of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why addressing the demand side is very important as well on this issue. I mean, I'll give you another example, in Bangladeshi example, where in 2000. So Bangladesh depends a lot on migrant workers' remittances, the economy. About $15 billion comes. And Saudi Arabia is one of the biggest importers of labor. They stopped taking Bangladeshi workers for 2 to 3 years, and the remittance dropped dramatically. So then in 2012, they said that, yes, we're going to open it up again, but there's one condition. For every 2 male workers, you have to send 1 female worker. And that was the condition. So government agreed to that. And then last few months, last year about 125,000 female migrant workers went. About 50% of that went to the GCC countries. And from Saudi Arabia itself, every day for the last 3 months, we have 20 to 30 female members on a flight coming back, harrowing tales of torture, exploitation. Government is doing nothing about it, neither the Saudi government, neither the Bangladeshi government. Because if they stop doing this, their Bangladeshi government is worried that the Saudi government may stop it again, and that's going to drop the remittances.
It's all about balance sheet.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think it's so also important that Thomson Reuters have this 9 journalists now looking at covering these issues in depth, because I feel like these kinds of issues don't get any airtime in the international media at all. So also the government doesn't get named and shamed. Of course, I don't know about Saudi government now. I mean,
no, but I think the point, when we also know that media is being attacked. Yeah. First they come for the journalists, and then we don't know what's happening. Right, we've got 20 minutes or thereabouts, and it's an opportunity now, please, for
15 minutes more.
Okay, fine, because we overran, so we can carry on. Can I say, Duncan, you were about to say something, I think. Forgive me, Hasiba.
Yeah, maybe to respond to you, we do see this commodification of people. It is not about individuals with rights, but it's about trade relations, and it's about migration control as well. So you'd have deals being secured with the government of Sudan, for example, at the expense of people in order to stop people crossing, regardless of their needs. And yeah, we do see governments, and we see it every time in Libya, completely abdicating their responsibility towards their nationals.
Yeah, so where they come from has ignored them and doesn't want anything to do with them. You know, I'm just like you, Hasiba. My family, were migrants. They weren't illegal migrants. The United Kingdom needed people to come from the traditional and tribalistic parts of South Asia to become and work in the traditional and tribalistic parts of England. They needed them. And there is still going to be a need. I mean, I was reading recently that Cyprus, for example, has a birth rate of 1 per family, 1.0. So in a short space of time, Cyprus's population is going to be shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And that may be true of Japan and other parts of the world as well. So the world needs migration, yet they want it on their terms. Innocent?
I mean, it's sad, because for me, like the work that I do in Malawi, we try to advocate for refugees to have the rights of employment, but we are told that if the government allows refugees to work legally, they will take over the economy. And yet, these refugees, they have gone through tough lives, they have learned how to work hard, and they have started shops, small shops. So to be able to sustain such economy, they have to pay a lot of bribes. But it's as if the government does not see that if they allowed refugees to access permit and pay maybe $500 for 2 years to access that permit, the money will go straight into the government and they will pay taxes. But it's becoming like, to be tough on refugees, it's a good thing to win votes. And yet, those migrants are doing something that is incredible, that is bringing value to the economy of the country. But it's like the votes against refugees seems like the right thing to do.
How do we change this narrative, Duncan?
Just also to build on that point, as well as pick up Francesco's point from earlier as well. I mean, certainly at least in terms of the people who are in need of international protection, there is more that could be done to manage the movement of people as well, through increased access to safe and legal pathways. We've talked about the importance before about resettlement. Right now, one of the very, very limited means that is available for support in Libya is through an emergency transit mechanism. So some people are being evacuated from Libyan detention facilities, taken to Niger, from where they can be processed for resettlement. Now, more commitments are needed for resettlement slots. We need more states to say we will take more people, because what that means is then we have more capacity. More people can be taken out of detention. But in terms of other areas as well, family reunification as well. That is one of the drivers for migration. It's one of the reasons why people undertake these incredibly risky journeys, because they just want to join up with family members. And that's not just people traveling along the central Mediterranean route, but also from other places, including from Syria. We are in the process of just finalizing a report that should be ready next month, just talking about some of the obstacles that are in the process for family reunification for those eligible in Europe. And some of the obstacles are just, they're really at a practical level. It may be costs as well in some cases. It may be that people simply can't access embassies because the only embassy that accepts applications happens to be in the next country, and no one's going to give me a visa to travel to that country. So it's a series of these practical obstacles that people face. And there's more that could be done also to tackle those, to then ensure that the people who are in need of international protection then don't have to face these kinds of crazy risks that we're talking about in the context of this panel, including then falling victim to trafficking in some cases.
Is there any good practice? Is there anywhere in the world that is doing well in this field, in tackling migration, modern slavery, in supporting the work that you do? Is there anywhere? Let's be optimistic. Can we find some optimism?
You'd be surprised by the example I'll give you. And actually, one of the most protective legal framework for victims of trafficking that we know is Italy. And they have been so ahead in terms of protecting victims of trafficking, in terms also of providing humanitarian protection to people who might not fit exactly the categories of the Geneva Convention to be considered as refugees, but who need protection clearly because they're fleeing all sorts of violence. It's Italy. Let's remember as well that Italy has let people disembark for several years with very little support. I also want to say, let's talk about Bangladesh, for example. Bangladesh has accepted in a span of a month more than the whole European continent in the span of several years. And somehow we also always expect that somebody will pick it up for you, not us. I'm not doing my share. So I think what we see is the need for international solidarity, is the need for responsibility sharing. And it's not refugees or migrants, it's not only a problem there, but it's a problem here. And we all have also the power to address it because we all vote as well.
Just to build on that as well, I mean, there's a lot at different levels that is really positive in Italy in terms of the response. I mean, the identification that takes place by a number of different organizations when people are disembarking, trying to find people with specific vulnerabilities, international protection needs, or possible victims of trafficking, the legislation in terms of providing for temporary legal status as well for people who may be victims of trafficking, or even in some cases people who have experienced severe trauma, including as a result of some of the the experiences in Libya that we've talked about. The training that's been provided for the people who are in charge of determining whether someone qualifies for refugee status or not, so that actually you have that body and the adjudicators in that body then making referrals to specialized organizations working with trafficking victims, because people are coming forward and displaying certain indicators that they may be victims of trafficking. Certain of the outreach by NGOs conducting these mobile health clinics, work by some of the prosecutors as well, in terms of being able to build a case when the victim is still very concerned about safety. So there's a lot of different levels that could also be replicated in other contexts as well.
And I think Uganda is doing well on the African continent because their refugee policies are really, really great, the best, I believe, in the world. And once refugees feel like we belong here, we have been accepted, they are able now to put their efforts to advance the economy of the country. So Uganda is really a model for Africa.
Francesco, I was just thinking, you must see the whole world in action. Who's doing a good job?
Yeah, no, I have to agree that Uganda is a very good example. Now, at the moment, I think is the country which is hosting the highest number of refugees in Africa. And sincerely, despite the concern that I also raised myself when we signed the EU signed the agreement with Turkey, but even Turkey, if you consider the number of people that now is in their country, 3 million of people, so they are doing a great job. And this is something that is extremely important to underline, because we had this chaos in Europe for 600,000 while they received 3 million in 1 year and a half. And this is also a reason of concern about the short sight of the governments, of our leaders at European level about this phenomena. This is when you compare what has happened in Bangladesh, a city like Genova, built in 3 weeks. What an impact could be for the country. So the generosity that we are experiencing all over the world is something that seems is missing in Europe in this moment. And in terms of relocation, this is something that has also feeded this far-right reaction or this growing xenophobia, especially in my country. Because, for example, we expected 30,000 people to be relocated in Europe out of 120,000 that were received in 1 year. And then only 2,000 were relocated despite all the agreements that they were reached at European level. And of course, immediately, this was used by the far right immediately to say the EU is failing, these people is stealing the job, and all the rhetorical approach that you know better than me. So I think that all over the world there are a lot of good examples, but unfortunately, even places on which the externalization is a practice that is a big reason of concern.
I'll talk to you. Yeah. The issue which we haven't really touched on really is what you said, Hasiba, you said earlier on about the rights that they get when they come into the country. Because then of course, if they are being enslaved or if they are in some way vulnerable, they will get some support. But evidently, that's not, I mean, as I say, in the UK, certain people don't have rights. So as if, is there something about, do the people of Bangladesh treat the people who are there as refugees with the respect that they deserve?
So it's interesting. We ran some surveys in the last 1 year, and unlike other areas, in this particular case, the refugee community is right next to the host community. They're very close to each other, right? So there's So that area was particularly poor on the first place. I mean, there were like 54% illiteracy, so, and 40% ultra poor. So they're feeling a bit of a brunt of this because one, the wage is coming down because a lot of these refugee people who are coming and started to work illegally, but at the same time, prices of essentials have gone up. So they're feeling the brunt. So whereas in the early days, the 70% of the host community thought it was a great idea, we are glad that we are hosting them, it came down to about 37% when we ran the survey in May, right? So that's for practical reasons. And that's why we are telling a lot of the international community that the host community also needs to be supported here because they're also feeling the brunt. Unfortunately, one thing is that the generosity also, when it hits your livelihood and belly, it has an expiry date. And for Bangladesh particularly, only 25% of the actual budget for the humanitarian cost is being funded by the international community. And so what we are telling them, and we with UNHCR, is that there can be other kinds of facilities that Bangladesh can negotiate, whether trade agreements, better deals in trade agreements and stuff, because getting 1 million people and having to kind of take care of them for a country like Bangladesh, which is already quite poor and very densely populated, it's a lot of burden. So even if the international community is not providing aid, they should be giving other trade facilities. And that's where this Jordan Compact-like solution, what they have done, comes with.
Innocent's point earlier on, you said because the states hosting the refugees aren't very often supportive, they're not getting enough income, they're not getting the kinds of material support they should get, they end up being taken by traffickers within the country.
Yes.
How do we resolve that? How do we deal with that? I mean, governments will say that, I've heard this, our priority is the people born here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do we change the narrative? How do we change this view?
I mean, there are several ways that we can do that. Because, for example, I know someone who lived in the same refugee camp where I was born. And he's in Malawi now. He has been a refugee for 46 years, but he has been denied a refugee status in Malawi, saying that his claim is not true and he doesn't deserve a refugee status. He called me to say, my son, can you help me secure $500 to pay bribe to be able to secure the refugee status? I said, yes, I can help you to find a lawyer who can take the person who's asking you for the bribe into prison. And he's like, no, my son, don't do that, don't do that. Otherwise, I'll be in trouble. I will not have anywhere to go.
Yeah.
So...
Forgive me, you carry on.
But, sorry. So, they are just fundamentals. You just need to understand, like, countries that are hosting refugees, they may not even know what is happening in the countries where the refugees are coming from. They have no research. But if they understand what is happening, or if they can get people from those countries to educate them, it will be easy for them to be able to grant rights for the people to be able to settle. Because if you don't feel loved, cared for, accepted in the country, like you just need to find a way to either get out or integrate in an illegal way.
I agree. Duncan?
Part of the process, and I think that what Innocent's talking about as well, is just making protection more meaningful as well. How do we move beyond just people have a temporary right in a particular country to actually then talking about transitions to longer-term residence where necessary, meaningful access to employment, meaningful access to education? How do we look at some of the barriers that sometimes then are impacting on people trying to move onwards in an irregular way? We look at this in the context of movement along the central Mediterranean, but also in other places as well, where people will give different reasons, and some of them are very practical, and some of them are very obvious reasons. My child couldn't attend school because there's a language requirement. My child needed to attain a certain language requirement before being able to enroll, but actually it's only accredited trainers that would be allowed that, and no accredited training was available. So these kinds of issues are things that we should be tackling. And I think that's part of the more global approach as well at the moment to try and provide greater access to effective protection.
I was just thinking, this is, in 3 weeks' time, it's the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And how many people know that? It's clearly we are failing in terms of our narrative, in terms of being able to talk about these basic issues. I mean, my favorite article is Article 24, the right to a holiday, by the way. But I think we've got to somehow work together on this. It seems like the international organizations are under attack. Individual countries, Uganda, Bangladesh, may be doing phenomenal work, but they seem to be doing it in silos, perhaps unsupported. I don't know what the European Union is doing. I don't know what the United Nations generally is doing. Duncan, you probably have a better view of that. But it does seem that the people who want to ensure that these vulnerable people are trafficked and harmed are winning. Is that fair assessment?
I'm not. Yeah, I mean, I think that overall, there has been this challenge in terms of the politicization of the language of refugees and of migrants, and the kind of stigmatization, and also a very selective picture in terms of how we've been looking at some of these issues. I think that, to be able to have much more of a frank discussion around this and talk about what opportunities there are for protection and also what it means for different states is something that's still, that needs to be more on the agenda at this point.
But you raised the issue of criminalization earlier. How you're presumably spending an enormous amount of your time, or your organization's time, ensuring that your staff aren't arrested, that your staff aren't prosecuted.
Yeah, and I think that's the trick, is that we are being diverted from what is our core business, which is to save lives. So we have tried to remain calm in the face of accusation, but clearly it's taking time and resources that we should be spending on saving people rather than responding to various prosecutors. We, of course, remain available to law enforcement and to the justice system. That's not the point. But more than the criminalization of the NGOs, of the solidarity, it's the criminalization of the people that is the most problematic. I just give you an anecdote. We were talking about the prevalence. I was discussing with some state official, and I'm not going to name the state, about the prevalence of sexual violence against women, refugees, and migrants in the country. And he looked at me and he said, but they're illegal. What do you expect? And that summarizes how vulnerable people are rendered by the laws of a country. If you are scared to go to the police to report a crime, if you end up being arrested rather than being treated as a victim who needs support, this is what happens. So there's a lot that could be done. Similarly, we need to create firewalls between law enforcement, especially for migration purposes, and access to services such as health and education. Should we penalize children because their parents have crossed the border in an irregular manner? And that's important that we look at these things and we try to minimize. So, of course, we need to find the right balance between the right of states to control entry and stay in their country. But the fact that you cross a border doesn't mean suddenly that you lose all your rights.
Just that point you mentioned about sharing information. Just in this country last week, the National Health Service decided that they were no longer going to share information with our Home Office because the information was being misused in relation to migrants or illegal migration, etc., etc. So there is the possibility of change. Yeah. If people or leaders decide to change. Yeah. Now, I'm conscious of the fact we're now into the last 30 minutes. I'm going to open it to you.
But maybe I'll add a point, is like, if you are a victim of trafficking, what are your chances to be able to seek help? It is also your interactions with medical professionals in a hospital, with the school of your children. They are able to detect signs, and you are able to suddenly get a sense of your rights. And we actually, in the name of fighting trafficking, we are making these people more vulnerable because we are not giving them access to all these services that could help them.
Sorry, Nazir, if I can just reinforce that as well. I was at a law enforcement event quite recently where there was an interesting comment by just one of the practitioners saying that there's a tendency then when people come forward seeking access to justice in certain regions then for their experience of trafficking, for law enforcement officers to respond to the immigration offense. But you entered the country irregularly, so, you know, we're finished. Yeah. And not explore further the other factors and not use the opportunity that actually would maybe be able to help address a particular network.
I mean, as you say, the offence against that migrant, undoubtedly that gang will be committing offences against citizens, in that sense. So they missed, as you say, the opportunity to tackle an organised network. Right.
Could I just make quickly one point? Recently, UNHCR and BRAC signed an agreement of capacity development. So where BRAC is going to train UNHCR staff on community development, whereas UNHCR is going to train us on how to respond better on humanitarian development. So this, I think, is a sign of times, because this is a recognition of the fact that in the coming days, there are going to be more and more these kinds of protracted conflicts that are going to lead to migration, which will be long-term, so which will need community-based resilience building. And also, going back to your original question, I mean, nothing is sacred anymore. In the age of fake news, we need to go back to basics. I think this is where we are.
I agree. Okay, I'm going to ask now the lights to go up slightly so that I can see those of you who would like. Please, no comments, no speeches. We'll invite you here up next year. Can we just have questions? You may want to identify an individual, but if you don't, I'll identify somebody on your behalf. Number 4, over there.
Thank you so much. Kevin Bales, Rights Lab, Nottingham, and I'm a migrant as well. Nazir, I'm going to disobey you instantly just to answer your quick question, which you said, is the first plane in full of traffickers? And the answer is no. We've been doing research on this as well. Sadly, that's a myth propagated by some unscrupulous organizations that want to cash in on the enormous charitable giving that follows on a disaster. What actually happens is that disaster brings trafficking to an end for a short amount of time, in the same way it brings law enforcement and services to an end. But then it creates enormous vulnerability, in which afterwards, 6 months afterwards, you see a rising increase in the amount because more and more people are put into situations of vulnerability that makes it easier for them to be trafficked. So that's the real story.
Okay, thank you so much. Question 2. There's no logic to the numbering, by the way.
Oh, thank you. My name is Veronica, and I'm from Mexico. So actually, well, in these days, as many people can know, my country is having these migrant caravanas that are groups of thousands of people from Latin America willing to get to the United States following the American dream. And I have found a duality of this problem, specifically in their way through my country. The thing is that my real question is, like, from your experience, which would be a key message from civil society, NGOs, private sector, and all the people involved, Mexicans and from other countries, to address this problem of these migrants that are really, really high risk of human trafficking?
Okay, thank you so much. Anybody wants to answer that question?
I can jump in on that. I mean, I think one of the key issues here is also just trying to strengthen protection for people where they are as well. So when people they may have traveled through other countries, but while they are in Mexico, part of it is, are there ways to be able to meet some of their protection needs and related needs in Mexico? People may still choose to move on, but if there is the means of being able to meet that in different ways, I think that's one important response that does need to be undertaken.
Siba, were you going to say something? You don't have to.
No. What we have tried to do is also to be present in the countries of origin, the countries of transit, and also the countries of arrival. but also to try to share information to make sure that people are able to make informed decisions. I have heard too many young girls on the Aquarius, especially from Nigeria, thinking that they were going to Italy because they have been promised an education, because they have been promised a job as a nanny or hairdresser, and thinking that the future was bright, to only be crushed. So one of the things that we've done, because it's to create possibilities for these people to receive information on the boat, but also to hear it from the people who might have influence on them. Who are we, MSF, after all, to be able to talk to Nigerian girls, for example? What do we know? And this is where we need to do better. And we have to be, we're not trying to discourage people, we just want to make sure that they know what they're getting themselves into.
Information. Next, number one.
Good morning. Joan Fulton from Geneva and Madrid, and former banker and current university business professor, so I'm always interested in long-term economic solutions. I heard the other day that the IMF has given a warning to the United States on GDP growth because they will need immigrants in the future for their economic development. And have you thought of turning the dialogue, flipping it around, and actually working with the governments and countries and the IMF as a supporter to justify why immigration should be more fluid, because it actually is a good business case, as was the question yesterday. So have you thought of them as an ally?
I'm sure the answer is yes, but is there anybody with particular detail on that? Francesca, you want to say something about that? The idea of, we all know there's a moral case, an emotional case, a legal case, but what about the business case? Why don't we talk about the business case for migration more than we do at the moment?
I think that you found a lot of information about the business case, but the question just reminded me something that, in my vision, is extremely important, because this phenomenon must change our mind and the way we traditionally approach this phenomena. I mean, for example, in the hosting countries, most of them are middle-income countries or very poor countries, and the International Monetary Fund and the other financial institutions should change the way they approach. I mean, and this is, could be read even against the humanitarian organization, but the humanitarian organization cannot fix this crisis alone by themselves. Must change the economy of the country. So it's not only about to give money and support to the humanitarian organization, but also to change the economy of the country to create more opportunities. Think about Jordan, think about Lebanon, think about Turkey, think about Uganda. If you want integration and if you want to create and to avoid trafficking and to avoid exploitation, you must create different opportunities. You might change the way the financial and the global finance is approaching the phenomena.
Absolutely. I'll take another question. Right at the back, number 3, is it?
Hello, my name is Camilla Monkton, and my question sort of fits into the theme of digitalization, but looking specifically at the use of aid budgets. So I, as many people did, lobbied very hard to get 8.7 in the SDGs. So modern slavery is now a sustainable development goal, but I worry now that some governments are using it to divert aid budgets towards anti-immigration initiatives. And not solely for anti-trafficking. So I work for a non-profit consultancy that works on a lot of government migration and anti-trafficking contracts centered around the protection of displaced people. But in the last year and a half or so, we've faced being asked by some governments to carry out contracts which fundamentally went against our mission statement of protecting vulnerable people.
Okay.
So the question is, have you noticed this change in donor behavior, funding protection campaigns, but are actually a guise for deterrence of immigration over actual protection?
Okay. Has anybody noticed?
Yeah.
That?
Yeah, this is something a concern that we share and that we see across the board in a number of countries. Aid to Afghanistan being subjected to them accepting returns. We see this in also in the relationship between European countries and African countries. We see as well, under the EU Trust Fund, all the support that is going to Libya and to a number of sub-Saharan African countries, a lot of migration control measures that are presented as development measure. And yeah, it's something that we see, something we raise, something we try to be vigilant to. It's going to be a difficult battle at the time of scarce funding.
I mean, the other side of that is that in the UK, for example, we've got a commitment of 0.7% of GDP will be spent on international aid. And there's been a lot of pushback on that. And so the government have had to change some of their language. So they talk about, for example, we are funding initiatives that are keeping us, Britons, safe. Mm-hmm. They may actually be funding exactly the same initiative they were funding last year, but it's the language that's being used that's changed in order to sell it to members of the public who may not necessarily buy into it. There's a question 3 in the middle, followed by question 4 and question 5. And question 5. Okay, we'll start with 3.
My name is Sarah Costa. I run the Women's Refugee Commission. And so I'm on the ground and I share the sheer frustration and anger of trying to work in the current political environment in so many of the countries that you've talked about, including with the Rohingya, but we also do a lot of work on the border and have been visiting the children in cages. So I suppose for me, running a research and advocacy organization, the question that comes up frequently is, how political do we get as humanitarian organizations in trying to push back against some of these things? We're seeing these policies of deterrence, detainment of people, but also we're seeing that the situation is not getting better and that the risks are increasing for trafficking and violence against women. And recently, we've just completed a survey in the border in Italy, and we've seen very, very high rates of sexual violence against men and boys as well. So, I'd love to hear the panel answer that question, is where do we stop being just humanitarian workers going in to do good, and when do we start actually speaking out and trying to form a coalition to fight some of this?
Okay. My sense is that everybody here will say, yes, we do it now.
Yes, can I?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, because this is a very tricky question for an organization like the Red Cross. Neutrality has been always our basis.
Yes.
And the reason of concern is exactly what I said during my remarks at the beginning. We are engaging the government in the discussion about respecting the neutrality. And you see, think about when humanitarianism was born, especially looking at our family, during the Solferino battle. The Battle of Solferino was famous because it was during the Second Independence War. And the founder of the Red Cross was in the middle of this battle, and they found the consequences, terrible consequences. But what inspired him were the women of Castiglione delle Stiviere. These women saying two simple words, tutti fratelli. In the midst of the highest moment of nationalism in Europe during the Second World War, they found the courage to say, tutti fratelli, we are all brothers. So this is about what my colleague just said. It's about to raise awareness. I don't want to fight the politicians. I want to work at the ground level. I want to work in the communities. I want to re-strengthen our network because the strength of Regional came from the civil society at the moment, and we have to restart from the civil society. The colleague said we have to restart from the basic. Our politicians and our leaders are not able, for me, and are not a serious interlocutor at this moment. Who is feeding this fear? Who is feeding this growing xenophobia? It is something that we had the experience in the past. Blaming entire communities, blaming entire vulnerable groups. When is the last moment that you have seen this in Europe? Yeah. Think about it. So it's about for us to work at community level to restore faith in the importance of neutrality. Protect neutrality is protect the humanitarian action. This is exactly the difference, and why I'm so concerned about the fact that it has become a political act, a simple act of pity.
Forgive me, there's a practical problem in some countries, in the UK particularly. If you're a charity working in this field, you are not allowed to be politically campaigning. You lose your tax breaks, etc., as a result. So one has to be very careful about the line that one has to step over.
Yeah. I think there's some kind of disunity among charitable organizations, but if you compare this unity and the unity that they have in terms of raising these big issues, the unity is quite large. But unfortunately, our voices are not usually heard. Like the issue of Libya, it took for CNN to go down and document and put the images across the world. Like, that's how the whole world got to understand about this. But before that, people, like NGOs, have been talking about it. So I think, yes, there is need for more unity, but I think we need the help of media than before.
And Thomson Reuters.
Can I just quickly...
Can I just, forgive me, Asif, because we've only got a short amount of time. If I take another question, you can ask the question. Right, which one was it? 2, 4 and 5. Those are the 3 I'm afraid I can take. So we'll start with 2.
My name is Juma Amaju. I just want to get clarification about what is happening in Yemen today. Do they fall under modern-day slavery or migration? Because we see in the news a lot of things that are happening there, but I don't know which category to place them. Yemen, the indigenous, the citizens are suffering. No humanitarian services being extended to them. How do we classify them?
Okay, thank you so much. Let me park that question. Let's hear from 4 and from 5, and perhaps merge the answers.
Yes, Steve Marola from International Justice Mission. I do have a question. I do know that humanitarian organizations have a humanitarian imperative, so the neutrality in what we do and focusing on what we do is there. But the world is changing dramatically at the moment if you look at these populistic movements all around the world. And my question is, what advice would you give to the civil society in this situation at the moment to stand up? Because on the end, it is a political question in 2 ways. First of all, even countries in Europe break international law systematically at the moment. And who is responsible for bringing them to which court? And second of all, why or how can we mobilize better the civil society to stand up and break the silence?
Okay, so Yemen, civil society, and number 5.
Hi, from Plan International. If one of the ways to reduce human trafficking is to effectively liberalise labour migration and open and create more safe routes for labour migration, would you advocate for a reduced set of core rights for those labour migrants in order to be able to liberalise labour migration and absorb more labour migrants? And if not, what would you recommend to the UK government in order to liberalise labour migration?
Thank you very much for those questions. You may choose to answer any of them. Asiba.
Well, I'll start maybe with the last one. It's very difficult to say that some rights are more important than others, and the right to work should trump the right to freedom of religion, for example, and I'm just picking one like that. What sometimes maybe... So, for example, I'm just going to give an example in relation to Bangladesh, where we do know that the authorities of Bangladesh are extremely nervous about using the refugee word. So we talk about forcibly displaced nationals of Myanmar. We don't want to be hung up on labels as well if the people get the right associated with that legal category. So if forcibly displaced citizens of Myanmar were to have access to education, services, freedom of movement, access to justice, and that could be an interim measure, why not? Because look where we're starting from. But of course, we shouldn't be chipping away protection systems that have been developed over so many years.
Duncan,
Everybody
any of
might
those
have a
particular questions you want to answer?
No, I mean, just to jump in on for us, the discussion around safe and legal pathways was specifically in the context of refugees moving, but it also, sometimes we limit that conversation to talking about just the traditional ways that then refugees move, which is through resettlement or family reunification, which I clearly fell into that trap in the way I was talking earlier. But also there are other ways, and that includes through labor migration schemes. It also includes through educational schemes as well. There have been some very good practices by some governments, including providing a set number of scholarships for refugees in particular countries to then go over to that country and, and then study with the possibility of then integrating later on. And I think we need to be making much more use of these kind of complementary pathways.
Innocent?
I mean, for me, I think I'll be controversial because I believe the issues with migration and refugees, yes, we can tackle the rights of employment, but the cause root is the wars and conflicts that unfortunately are started by most of Western countries. And these are the people that we give the power through our votes. So as I said earlier, that we need to redefine those conflicts. And we have the media. We can use the same platforms that the politicians use to propagate lies. So there are three things that you can do. One, to really make sure that our governments are taken to task in terms of not fueling wars, especially in third countries. And then the labor can come in. But I think the beginning is the wars that cause the influx of refugees and migration.
Jessica, do you want to comment on the safe pathways question? Comment.
But the safe pathways is something that we always underline. If I may, I would like before to say some word about Yemen, if you allow me, because this is one of the neglected crises of the moment. It's people of Yemen is living this terrible blockade, which is completely inhuman, because it's very difficult for the humanitarian organization to provide aid in this moment to the population of Yemen. And when this morning I talked about the useless treaty, the useless compact, what we are experiencing in Yemen, think about when we celebrated a few years ago the agreement and the treaty about the trade of weapons, which is something that sounds ridiculous if we look at the Yemen crisis, at the Yemen situation. Second, what is happening, it's even worse because they are systematically bombing the health facilities and the facilities of the humanitarian organization. And our colleagues of MSF knows very well what they are living day by day in, and even the colleagues, our colleagues of the ICRC working there. So you are completely right. This is something that is in our heart, and every occasion is right to remind to all the people how serious is the situation in Yemen at the moment. Back to the safe path and the legal avenues. I'm not a politician, and I don't want to be naive. This is a very complex situation. So the responsibility that lies on our leaders, our political leaders, is to provide legal information. We don't want to interfere in the policies. We think that migration is something that must be treated like we are trying to do with the Global Compact in Marrakesh, giving an order to the migration, but it's up to them to provide legal avenues. I don't have a clear answer. I see that what they are doing at the moment is not enough. Our colleagues just talked about the fact that even those who must be protected, that are fleeing war and conflict and must be protected under the international law, are not relocated from Libya and Niger. So the situation is really a concerning one. I don't have a clear answer about the safe avenues at the moment. It's more up to our politicians that should answer to this question, which they are not.
As if you have the final word.
Yeah, I mean...
yes, you've got a microphone.
I want to take on the first two questions. I mean, very quickly, we can't be political. I mean, the neutrality is so important. I mean, we have to trade such a fine line and such a sensitive line. So we have to be very politically astute. But the partnerships are more important than ever because of that. Because, you know, back in the early days of the Rohingya crisis, we were in a particularly difficult spot because on one hand, we are running this operation in Bangladesh, but we are also operating in Myanmar. So, but there were real work had to be done from the activism and the human rights abuse cases. So we struck a very strong partnership with Amnesty, where Amnesty kind of used all our resources, but we were not public about this partnership in terms of coming up with reports and investigations. At the same time, so we were facilitating the work, but we were not taking any active position on that. So that's the kind of, I believe, partnerships are becoming more important. Advocacy organizations working with humanitarian organizations, development organizations working with humanitarian organizations, private sectors, those are the things that are very important. And last but not the least, the big elephant in the room, there's this basically a breakdown of moral authority in the world right now, right? I mean, in this country, particular country, Saudi Arabia, we're talking about causing a famine in the Yemen like that. On the other hand, killing people in their own consulates, but no Western country is taking them to task. And just because they have a very strong arms treaty with all of these guys. So that's basically, that's where the rot starts. And I think then more and more countries get away with these kinds of gross human rights violation. This is likely to happen more.
Okay, on your behalf, I'd like to thank my panel. We could,
Can I ask a question?
Please, Moni.
I mean, it's not really a question. It's more a reflection. I mean, thank you for this extraordinary panel, and this is such a shame to all of us, and especially us in the media that obviously cannot reflect what you have all said. We are writing that. I mean, Reuters has 2 journalists in jail in Myanmar just because they were covering the Rohingya genocide properly. So we are all covering it, and Reuters is not alone. I mean, everybody, the Thomson Reuters Foundation, AP, AFP, all of them are covering it. But we cannot give that feeling that we express here today is we are, I mean, Francesco said it. Remember the last time that we were criminalizing one community, and it was in Europe, and it was in 33 to 39. And we see that. We should act on it. We should act urgently on it. And what I regret, because Anish Kapoor was due to come to speak yesterday and he couldn't come. He has this concept, which I think is a brilliant concept. And we have discussed it a lot together, and I would like to associate many others in that discussion. It is a concept of a parliament for migrants. And how do we create a place where maybe the migrants will not come. He has bought a big thing in Venice, and he wants to do it there. Migrants coming to Venice today is impossible, of course. So you know, but at least a place where we would act on these issues, where we would take action, where we would give them a voice. And I would like to leave all of you thinking of that. What we could do with this concept, which could be, I think, almost a revolutionary concept if we put it right. And it's difficult to put it right. So just a reflection. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Monique. Thank you so much. Okay, our time is up. And I just want to leave you, I mentioned earlier on, can I thank my colleagues? I'll ask you to formally thank them in a moment. I'll leave you with a thought. I did say the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is 70 years old in 3 weeks' time. And it starts with talking about dignity. Not about human rights follow. It talks about dignity. Because it does so for a reason. It says basically the human rights are not something you just get because you're wealthy, or because you are somehow required to have them, or because of your good behavior. They are an entitlement because you're human. And that's something we need to get back to. And we need, in the conversation that we've had, I'm absolutely certain that you're as angry as I am, as my colleagues are here. but anger needs to be turned into something positive. And I think what Monique has just suggested is one of those suggestions. So I ask you, please, to leave the rest of this day and from now on to think about what you can do differently, because it's only by doing something differently that you make a difference. So thank you very much, and thank you, my panel.